for in his graduate work at the University of Wisconsin. He deals in his work with issues of international trade and public policy. And he has 4 prestigious journals in which he has published, which I do not remember the names of, and I apologize. So please welcome Chris McGee.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking about trade issues today, and when I talk about trade with my classes at Bucknell, one of the things I will often have them do is to take off one of their shoes and see where it's made. And for about 90% of the class, it's made somewhere outside of the United States. So I won't have you do that here. No shirt, no shoes, no service would probably apply, but. You know, tonight, when you're going to bed and you're changing out of your clothes, you might look at your different clothes that you've got on and see where they're made. So I looked at my clothes from yesterday, and I had clothes from Vietnam, Honduras, China, Mexico, Bangladesh, and Egypt. I didn't have anything from the United States. I looked at my clothes today, same thing. I had also London, and then I had a few things from China today. So we all tend to wear a lot of clothes that are coming from other countries, and think about why we do that, why we would buy clothes from abroad. You know, we can get clothes for cheaper, you know, if they're produced somewhere else than if they're produced in the United States. So that's an advantage to us as consumers. We can get a wide variety of clothing that we might not otherwise get if we blocked off imports of clothes. If we only could wear clothes from the U.S., we wouldn't have the variety that we have, you know, kind of these days, where we can import goods from all around the world. We also gain from allowing imports of clothing in that, you know, some places produce very nice, fine clothing, and so maybe we're getting higher quality for some items, you know, when we import. We don't maybe tend to think of that so often in terms of clothing, but you think of Swiss watches, you know, or Persian rugs, or German cars and Japanese cars. You know, they have reputations for having high quality items that we get. And we wouldn't get those things if we tried to produce everything ourselves as a country, right? So if we blocked off all our imports of clothes and bought only U.S. made items, I don't think that would make us better off, right? Some workers in the U.S. who would produce clothing, and maybe perhaps a few firms that produce clothing in the United States would be better off. But as a country, we would be worse off, right? Consumers all around the country would be hurt. We'd have to pay more for our clothes, and then we would have less money that we could spend on all the other items that we buy. So the other industries where we're trying to produce other goods that consumers are buying would be hurt slightly by having consumers who had to pay more for our clothing, right? So the economists in general just argue that we should allow free trade, essentially, that we should be able to import goods without any trade barriers blocking us from buying foreign imports if we want to. Right? The normal argument for why we might want to block off imports is that it can save U.S. jobs, right? We're protecting U.S. jobs by blocking off imports of something. But if you think about the logic there, you know, why the U.S. might choose to block off imports from China or from the rest of the world in order to protect U.S. jobs, that same logic would apply to Pennsylvania. You know, we import a lot of cars from Ohio and Michigan, and so Pennsylvania might want to protect its jobs by blocking off imports from Ohio and Michigan, and then Lewisburg might want to protect its jobs by blocking off imports from Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. And clearly we wouldn't be better off as a country if we did that, if we had lots of little localities all trying to protect themselves from imports from around the rest of the country. You know, we actually, our U.S. Constitution actually prevents us from doing that. States can't put any trade barriers, any taxes on on imports from other states in the country, right? The Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution says, no tax or duty shall be laid on articles that are exported from any state. So we have a big free trade area here within the United States, and I think that that's benefited us as a country. And you could make the same argument that the world would be better off if we had a free trade around the world. Then wherever goods could be produced most efficiently, they would be produced, and then we would all buy from each other and we would trade with each other. Right? So that's my economist viewpoint, is that the world is better off if we move toward a world with fewer trade barriers. Right? So when we allow imports, we trade with the rest of the world. That I don't think that affects the total number of jobs that we have in our country, but it does affect the type of jobs that we have. So the U.S., for instance, we've had a big trade deficit for many years, and according to the CIA World Fact Book, the trade deficit in 2016 was about $750 billion. So that's 4% of the U.S. GDP. So we have a big trade deficit relative to our economy. But at the same time, we've got an unemployment rate that's extremely low. 3.7% is the unemployment these days. So it's hard to look at those numbers and say, well, the fact that we're importing all these goods is costing us jobs, because it's hard to see the unemployment rate being any lower than it is right now. I think that if you look around the world, the countries that are open to trade are richer than the countries that are more closed off from trade. There's a clear positive correlation between the income per person in a country and how open they are to trade. And the more open countries are richer. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that the countries kind of become richer because they're more open. It could be that countries kind of grow and become rich, and then they open up to the rest of the world. So it's tough to draw a causal relationship and say that the causality always runs from being open to trade to being richer. But it's clear if you look around the world that the richer countries are more open. Right? So when economists are surveyed, 90% of us will say that trade barriers generally reduce economic welfare for a country, the general economic welfare, that free trade is preferable to having high trade barriers. Now, I think that the best way that we can liberalize trade, that we can open up to trade with the rest of the world, is through international agreements with all other countries, or at least like through the World Trade Organization, we can negotiate lower trade barriers with a lot of different countries simultaneously. That hasn't proven to be very successful over the last several decades. We haven't had any new trade deals through the World Trade Organization since the early 1990s. So most countries have been forming bilateral trade agreements with one or two other countries, or regional trade agreements with a group of countries in their area. So the U.S. did that in the 1980s. We formed a trade agreement with Israel, for political reasons, probably more than economic ones, because they weren't a huge trading partner with us. Then we formed a trade deal with Canada, and we had free trade with them. And then Mexico decided to join that, so we negotiated the North American Free Trade Agreement. And we've since negotiated trade deals with Chile and South Korea and lots of countries around the world, some of the Central American countries. So we've negotiated a lot of bilateral trade deals and regional trade agreements. Right? When we do those, when we negotiate these trade deals, it affects what we produce. We start to import some goods that we would otherwise produce here domestically in the U.S. And so some of the workers who are in those industries are hurt. They'll lose their jobs. And then other jobs are created somewhere in the country. So the workers who are losing their jobs, my personal feeling is that we need to take care of those workers. You need some kind of a social safety net to help them, or some kind of programs that help them get retrained and find new jobs. Right? But that's the standard economist's answer to trade. Does create some dislocations, and workers will lose their jobs. But then if you have good programs to help the workers find new jobs, then you're taking care of the people who are hurt by the trade, and then the country as a whole is gaining some of the advantages of being able to buy the goods from other countries around the world that they can produce relatively efficiently. Right. The current trading system around the world was a response to what happened in the Great Depression. So in 1930, the U.S. was just entering the Great Depression, and we passed a new trade bill that raised tariffs from about 37% in the 1920s up to almost 50% in the 1930s. So that was the Smoot-Hawley Trade Act, and other countries retaliated against our higher tariffs, and every country around the world started kind of trying to protect their own economy, and it didn't work very well. Trade volumes fell dramatically in the 1930s, and the whole world kind of was sinking into a depression. So when World War II ended, there were the U.S. and 22 other countries signed a new trade agreement called the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, or the GATT. And one of the principles of that was that the countries would treat all of their trading partners equally. Right? There's non-discrimination in your imports. So the idea was that we could negotiate a trade deal with other countries, and then if we lowered our tariffs on car imports to 10% on any country, then we would charge all other countries a 10% tariff. Right? We wouldn't have different tariffs on every other country's imports. So that was one of the principles of the GATT agreements. And we had a series of GATT rounds of trade deals that successfully reduced tariffs over time, so that by 2016, our average tariff was down to about 3.5%. So that's where we are today. So it came down from about 50% as of the early 1930s down to about 3.5% today, right? And the way the trade deals worked is we would agree to reduce our tariffs on car imports. They're now down at about 2.5%, and we would bind those tariffs. So we would say the trade deals would say that we agree not to raise our tariffs on cars above a certain level, and so the tariff rate is kind of bound at that level, and that's how we would kind of sign these trade deals. Other countries would then agree that they're going to limit their tariffs on every different type of good to certain levels, right? So in the early 1990s, the World Trade Organization was formed in the last GATT round that was successfully completed, and so now there are 164 members of the World Trade Organization. And the key new thing that the World Trade Organization had was it had this dispute settlement process where if a country feels like the U.S. is doing something unfair in its trade, it's breaking its obligations that it's signed under the trade deal, then they can bring a dispute against the U.S. The World Trade Organization will set up a panel of judges. 3 judges will hear the case, and then they'll make a decision. And so that dispute settlement process was kind of a new aspect of the World Trade Organization that hadn't really been there for the GATT before that. Over the post-war period, since World War II, the trade as a share of the world economy grew dramatically. So as of 1960, trade was about 24% of world GDP, and most recent figures are about 58%. So trade is a much bigger part of our world economy today than it was near the end of World War II. All right? And I think the U.S. was the prime mover in kind of pushing for these, for a rules-based trading system around the world. All right? The system that we've got constrains every country to operate within these general rules of non-discrimination against foreign exporters. And I think that the U.S. could certainly browbeat individual countries into giving us trade deals that we like, because a lot of other countries are sort of dependent on the U.S. market in ways that we aren't necessarily dependent on them. I think you probably saw that most recently in the North American Free Trade Agreement renegotiations, where Canada and Mexico are both more at the mercy of the U.S. than we are at their mercy, because their economies are something like 60% to 65% of their trade goes to the United States, whereas for us, it's more like 10 to 15% of our trade is with them. So the U.S. is not as reliant on their economies as they are on ours, and that gives us kind of negotiating power to take advantage of if we want to. I think for a long time we weren't really taking advantage of that power we had individually. We were operating under the assumption that what works best for the world is going to be, let's set up a kind of a rules-based system, everyone negotiates together, and then that brought a lot of other countries into the World Trade Organization that would not otherwise have been there. So we kind of pushed the World Trade Organization approach, and I think now we're sort of moving away from that more recently. Right. So one worry I have is whether this kind of rules-based system of trade that we have, whether that's going to survive the Trump administration, because I think that the Trump administration prefers to kind of negotiate one-on-one with other countries and kind of exert more leverage and take advantage of our power over individual other countries when we can. Right? So I'm going to talk about the Trump administration policies here, and I'll be critical of the Trump administration. I'll say that it's not a partisan critique. I would say that my personal trade policy preferences are sort of close to what the congressional Republicans have always felt about trade. So when the North American Free Trade Agreement passed through Congress, for instance, about 75% of the Republicans in the House supported it, and about 40% of the Democrats in the House supported it. So it was, the congressional Republican position was in favor of these trade agreements. The congressional Democratic position was more skeptical of these trade agreements, and my personal policy preferences sort of lined up with what the congressional Republicans kind of traditionally felt about the policies, that the more open trade policies are better. All right, I think President Trump's view on trade is much darker, or he's more anti-globalization than the congressional Republicans have always been. So Bob Woodward has a book out, Fear, and I heard a podcast with him on it, and he noted that one of President Trump's speeches, President Trump had written in the margins, in his handwriting, like trade is bad, and so that was one of the messages he was giving in his speech, and I think that his views are very, what I would call mercantilist. So prior to Adam Smith, the dominant economic viewpoint was mercantilism, which was the idea that a country's wealth is based on how much gold and silver was within the country. Anything that would lead to gold and silver flowing in would be good. So things like exports are good because gold and silver flows in when you sell goods to foreign countries. Imports are bad, though, because you're buying a good and gold and silver would be flowing out. The mercantilists argued for trade barriers and things that would block off any imports, because there's a way of kind of keeping the gold and silver within the country. And trade deficits are terrible under that view. And I think that's very much the view of trade that President Trump has. So if you listen to his speeches or read his tweets, he'll say things like, we lose $800 billion a year on trade every year. So he's talking about the trade deficit that we have, and he's portraying it as if we're losing money every time we import goods, right? So another tweet he had said, tariffs are the greatest. Either a country which has treated the United States unfairly on trade negotiates a fair deal, or it gets hit with tariffs. It's as simple as that, and everybody's talking. Remember, we're the piggy bank that's being robbed. So when we're importing goods, that's being portrayed as if other countries are taking advantage of us and kind of robbing us of something that we would otherwise have. And finally, in March of this year, it said when a country is losing many billions of dollars on trade with virtually every country it does business with, Trade wars are good and easy to win. For example, when we were down $100 billion with a certain country and they get cute, don't trade anymore, we win big, it's easy. So again, the idea is that when we have a trade deficit with a foreign country, we're losing because of that, because money is going out, so somehow we're losing money. And I think what that misses is the fact that we're buying goods. When we buy goods from another country, the other country gets some cash and we get the goods. So we're not losing the money, we're gaining the goods, or we're making a trade. I think all of you, unless you're working for Giant or Weiss or Walmart, you probably have an enormous trade deficit with them because you buy stuff from them all the time and you never sell anything to them, right? So it's not like they're taking advantage of you or that you're losing money because you're shopping there. You're making an exchange. It's good for them. They get to sell you goods that you pay more than they paid to get. It's good for you because you get the goods that you want at less than it would cost you to produce the goods yourselves. So it's a win-win trade, and that's the way I view international trade as well. You want to create these chances for mutual gains from trade, where both countries gain. With largely open trade policies, you can have those gains. If you get into trade fights with other countries and you start blocking off each other's trade, then I think that's harming both countries. Right? So what's happened over the past 2 years is that we've started putting on a lot of trade barriers that we didn't used to have, right? And this is, I think the goal is very much to try to create jobs in the United States, especially in certain industries, right? When you hear the Trump administration, particularly President Trump, talk about jobs, he's often talking about jobs in manufacturing, in steel and coal and cars, right? So they're viewing trade policy as a way to try to stop imports in those goods so that we can start producing more of those goods ourselves, and then we'll have some extra jobs in manufacturing that we didn't used to have. So in the last year, we've put tariffs on imports of steel and aluminum and solar panels and washing machines. So we have tariffs on over $100 billion of those goods. We put 25% tariffs on imports from China in July and August. That's $50 billion worth of imports from China. China began to retaliate against the U.S. and put tariffs on some of our exports. And so we upped the ante and we put 10% tariffs on $200 billion more imports from China that started in late September. So they're 10% tariffs now until the end of the year, but they're going to jump to 25% tariffs starting in January 1st, 2019. That's almost half of the imports from China then are getting hit with these new tariffs. And we're threatening tariffs on the remainder of the imports from China. So that's about $267 billion more imports that might get hit with new tariffs. I think if you look at the new tariffs we've put on goods, we put on new tariffs on 12% of U.S. imports total, just in 2018. So we've got a lot of new tariffs on imports this year. Foreign countries, of course, don't like this, so they're retaliating against us. And now 8% of our exports are being hit by retaliation, tariffs from countries that are retaliating against the U.S. So that's about $125 billion of U.S. exports that are being hit by that, right? So we might try to decide, well, we're in this trade war, are we winning? And I would say no one really wins a trade war. So the only way we might be winning is that maybe we're causing more harm to other countries than we're suffering ourselves. That's not really winning in my book, but it's it's the only kind of winning that happens, I think, when you get into a trade war like this. Right? One of the big kind of looming threats for tariffs on the horizon is on auto imports. So the the Trump administration has begun an investigation into whether auto imports harm U.S. national security. And so we're kind of threatening to put a 25% tariff on auto imports from countries around the world. I'm not sure whether that'll happen or not. Seems like there's some groups within the government, like the Treasury Department, that even the U.S. Trade Representative office kind of opposes the new tariffs on car imports. But we'll have to see what happens with that. Some people have done studies that try to estimate what the effect would be if we do put a tariff on car imports. They typically find that there'd be a small number of lost jobs in the U.S. because of car imports. So I'll say small, it's going to sound big, but the U.S. is estimated to lose about between 120,000 and 200,000 jobs if we put tariffs on cars. And the reason is that we would gain some jobs in the auto industry, but we'd lose jobs in kind of related fields like machinery, electronic and transport equipment, other manufacturing. So we gain some jobs, we lose others. The job effect is small relative to the overall economy. And if we're creating something like 200,000 jobs every month, and we lose somewhere between 100 and 200,000 jobs, with the tariff, then it's going to be hard to really notice that effect, just because it's going to be similar to about half, a couple of weeks fluctuation in jobs in the United States anyway. Right? But it would affect a lot of imports, over $200 billion worth of imports of cars, and so if we put tariffs on car imports, then a lot of other countries are going to be hurt. They're mainly our allies. So we import a lot of cars from Japan and Korea and Germany. We're not really importing cars from rivals like China. So the car tariffs would not be hitting kind of strategic rivals. They'd be hitting allies more. Right? So a worry that I have in terms of how the tariffs were put on steel and aluminum in the past year, and then also potentially on cars, is that we use this, we use the national security exception in the World Trade Organization agreements to put these tariffs on. So the tariffs, or the deals we've signed with the World Trade Organization say, we bind our tariffs to be below some level on each good, but get this exception that says nothing in this agreement shall be construed to prevent any contracting party, that's the countries, from taking any action which it considers necessary for the protection of its essential security interests. So we always have this out that, if a country feels like for national security reasons it needs to block off imports, then countries are allowed to do that, right? But that exception has not been used very often, and I think that the Trump administration is essentially using that exception to get around the rules, the World Trade Organization rules, I would say. Because each country decides on its own what its essential security interests are, and so it's if every country can just appeal to national security and then put whatever trade barriers on they want to, then you've kind of got this problem that any trade deals they sign are sort of worthless, because you agree not to raise your tariffs, you agree not to block off imports, but then the next year you say, well, but I'm going to do that anyway because it's in my security interest. Then the trade deals you've signed kind of have lost their meaning. Right? So some of the foreign governments are challenging the steel and aluminum tariffs with the World Trade Organization, and this creates a real dilemma for the WTO, because if the WTO rules with the U.S. and says yes, the U.S. can do this because it's in its national security interest, and each country decides on what that means, then essentially, as I said, any country could put trade barriers on any product they want to, claim that it's in national security interest, and then the trade deals are kind of meaningless. If the World Trade Organization rules against the U.S., then that's already gonna make the Trump administration want to pull out of the WTO even more, and then that can kind of bring the whole trading system down. If the U.S. is pulling out of the WTO, then I'm not sure that the WTO will kind of be able to continue on and have credibility around the world and have support without having the U.S. supporting it. Right? We're already doing something sort of sneaky that's undermining the World Trade Organization, which is that the dispute settlement process, as I said, was, the WTO is supposed to have 7 judges that are available, and then when there's a dispute, they pick 3 of the judges to hear a case. And what the U.S. has been doing, we've been upset about some of their past rulings, so what we've been doing is blocking any appointment of new judges. So we don't have 7 anymore with the World Trade Organization. We're down to 4 judges now. By the end of 2019, 3 more of those are going to be, their term's going to end. So as of the end of next year, we won't have enough judges to actually hear these dispute cases. And I think that's kind of by design. I think that what the Trump administration would rather have is kind of no dispute settlement process, rather than one which they see as kind of putting constraints on countries and limiting our sovereignty. Right, so we'll have to see what happens with that, but right now it's sort of looking like the dispute settlement process is broken and may not be fixed, maybe going by the wayside. Okay. The other big trade policy change in the last several years was to renegotiate the North American Free Trade Agreement. So we've got a new trade deal called the USMCA, US-Mexico-Canada Agreement. The big change there was to try to get more cars produced in North America. So there's an increased share of the value of the car that has to be produced within North America for the car to be able to be shipped across borders and still have no trade barrier. Right? I'm sort of relieved that the NAFTA wasn't entirely eliminated. Estimates of what would happen there was that Canada and Mexico would be hurt by getting rid of NAFTA quite a bit. They'd lose about 2% of their GDP. The U.S. would lose about 0.2% of our GDP. So we'd be hurt only a little bit, and Mexico and Canada would have been hurt a lot. I'm not convinced that the new agreement is really much of an improvement over NAFTA. I think it's pretty similar to what we had before. The U.S. got a little bit more access to the Canadian dairy market. Canadians are protecting their dairy market, and possibly more cars will be produced within the U.S. and Canada. We'll have to see if that happens or not. But overall, I think the Trump administration has been worried about lost manufacturing jobs. And I think they've been too ready to sort of blame trade for that. We're actually producing a lot more manufacturing goods now than we used to. We're just doing it with fewer workers because of automation. So I think, for me, most of what's happening in manufacturing is that we're kind of replacing workers with machinery, and that raises our efficiency and it lets us produce more goods. But if you just look at manufacturing jobs and you say we're losing manufacturing jobs, and if we blame foreigners for that and try to block off our imports, I think that's the wrong way to go, right? And I sort of worry that a nostalgia for a 1950s style U.S. economy based on steel and cars is kind of making us, leading us into these trade wars and making us possibly sort of destroy the trading system that we've gradually built up since World War II over the past 70 years. On that happy note, I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah. 2 points.
Okay.
This morning, I noticed in the New York Times online economics section that there's a great graphic of this year's tariff war between both China, Canada, and the European Union. They has a timeline, and in that graphic, it shows the successive arrangement of tariffs, tit for tat approach, and it lists graphically through an animation that process. It was eye-opening when I went through that this morning, because you scroll down and you see the developing process. It was interesting in that respect. The one thing I'm noticing, both from you and several other economists, is the fact that what we're doing basically, not only in destabilizing trade, we're destabilizing trust, and we're destabilizing basically a larger measure of security nationally or internationally at this point. And just those are the comments. But, I mean, there's like huge amount more we can delve into. In fact, the local impact could be, because I know of farmers locally that are on the verge now.
Right, so a lot of the Chinese retaliation has hit U.S. exports of farm goods, and so farmers are hurting for that. And that's part of the reason for the $12 billion kind of government subsidy that's now going to farmers. I'll say on the China front, I think the U.S. does have some legitimate criticisms of the way that China operates. They will bend the rules of the World Trade Organization in several ways. The big one for me is when U.S. companies want to set up and produce in China or sell into China, they're very often required to sign a deal with a Chinese firm that they're operating together, and then the U.S. firm is pressured or required to share their technology. And so there's kind of this forced technology transfer that is probably unfair. And the Obama administration criticized China for that, and the Trump administration has criticized China for that. So there are some concerns about things that China is doing. My feeling is that the best way to counter that would be to put together a big coalition of countries who all have the same concern, put pressure on China, and try to get that changed, either through the World Trade Organization or through kind of joint international pressure. The Trump administration has chosen more of a kind of we're going to slap a bunch of tariffs on China, and that's the back and forth kind of tariffs and retaliation that you're talking about at the graphic that the New York Times showed. I don't think that's been as effective as it could have been, because we're also simultaneously sort of picking fights with other countries. If we kind of organize them all together and put pressure on China jointly, that might have been a more effective approach. But at the same time, I do recognize that there are some concerns about what China's been doing that we should kind of try to respond to in some ways.
Professor McGee, what is your view of the appropriate use of tariffs in our trade policy around human rights issues globally?
So that's difficult. Trade policy, tariffs are one way that you could punish countries for human rights abuses, and you could put pressure on them to clean up their act. I'm not sure whether I think that's the best way to do it, or whether I certainly agree that we want to put pressure on foreign countries to stop human rights abuses. And I'm sort of okay maybe with tariffs being threatened or used in pursuit of that goal. It does complicate things, if you're negotiating a trade deal, and then you also negotiate worker rights, and then you also negotiate environmental rights and human rights. It does complicate getting a trade deal through. So you may not get any deal if you try to bring everything into one. But if you separate them out, then you're taking away some of the carrot or the stick that you would have to get other countries to improve on their human rights abuses. So. In general, I'm in favor of free trade, But I could see the use of a trade barrier or the threatened use of a trade barrier as a way of putting pressure on other countries to improve on their human rights.
Somebody else have a case?
I'm trying to figure out the math on the car import.
Okay.
So if I want to buy a Japanese car, but most of it is being assembled in Tennessee, where does this 25% come?
So,
On the roof?
yeah, a lot of, I mean, if you buy a Ford or a Chevy, or you buy a Toyota, chances are about the same percentage of the cars produced in the United States as in abroad. You know, the U.S., I saw at one point a statistic on what fraction, which cars had the most kind of content produced within the U.S. And it wasn't the typical U.S. companies. It was a lot of the what we think of as foreign companies that were actually producing a little bit more of the value of the car within the borders of the U.S. So that's a good question. My understanding is that the 25% tariff would be on if the final car came into the U.S. from abroad, no matter how much of it was produced within the borders of the U.S., it would be hit with that tariff. So the final assembly of the car then would have to take place within the borders of the U.S. in order for it to not face that tariff. The tariff would dramatically raise the price of cars in the U.S. is what I think would happen. So we would all pay a lot more if the tariff goes into place. So consumers would be hurt by that. And that's why most studies kind of don't like the car tariff or find that on net it's going to have a negative impact on the U.S. But you're absolutely right that regardless of what company you're looking at, you know, that they all have these supply chains where they're producing part of the car. Every part of the car is produced wherever it's most efficient to be produced, and so there's a graphic in the Washington Post that showed kind of different steps that a Lexus was produced, and it had its body cast in Arkansas, and then the engine was added in Tennessee, and then it was shipped to Canada, where it was the final assembly took place, and then it was imported back into the U.S. to be sold. And so, so even though in trade it looks like the U.S. is importing a final car, you know, really a lot of that value of that car was being produced in the U.S.
Following up on cars,
Okay.
or another question on cars, what's the rationale that the tariff on cars is a national security? Is it, you know, to keep the steel industry going so that it has to be transferred over to war manufacturing or something like that? Or anyway.
I don't think there's a good national security argument, honestly, for having a tariff on cars or even on steel, say. We were getting most of our steel imports from allies and not from strategic rivals like China. So, so the fact that we're importing steel from Canada is not a national security threat to us unless we could possibly go to war with Canada, which I never would have thought possible. But yeah, I don't think there's a great national security interest argument. The Trump administration has essentially said, if you're not producing steel and cars, you don't have a country. You know, that you need to have these types of jobs in order to have a strong economy, and the strong economy underpins the national security of the country. So it's a very broad definition of kind of national security. It's, you need a strong economy, and these things will help us have a stronger economy so that we can have a strong military.
All of these, the tariffs, as I understand it, would make a lot of goods cost more. So that's going to increase inflation. Are there studies now about how much inflation is going to go up and what impact that's going to have on the economy?
So I think that's right, that the prices will go up. Now, there's sometimes when tariffs are put on, the foreign companies don't end up raising, if they don't raising their prices as much as you would think, because they don't want to lose their market share. And so, so there's sort of mixed evidence on how much prices will go up. I think it's, in the long run, it's certainly true that if we have more tariffs, that's going to push prices up. I think that hurts us as a country in a second way, which is that, you know, the Federal Reserve is responsible for making sure that we don't have too much inflation in the economy. And so if prices start rising because we're blocking off imports, then they're going to have to raise interest rates and slow the economy down to fight the inflation. So we're not going to gain, as a whole country, we're not going to gain more jobs by blocking off imports. You know, instead you're going to get these secondary effects that are probably going to be harmful to the country, or they're going to offset any immediate job gains you might get in a directly affected industry.
Yeah, my question is real basic. As you were describing or putting a name to the way you figure Trump sees the economy, this mercantile idea. So Adam Smith represented progress, right? So could you just explain a little bit of what his contribution has been?
Right, so Smith argued that you don't want to see wealth of a country as how much gold or silver is in the borders. The wealth of a country comes from how productive their workers are. If the workers in a country are able to produce goods and are highly productive, then they're going to generate a lot of income, and that's going to be the source of wealth. You know, you're producing a lot of goods, that's good for the consumers, they get to buy the goods, but the country as a whole, it's also good for. And so Smith kind of argued against the mercantilist view. And then the other big trade economist historically was David Ricardo. So Ricardo's, you know, set up this model where countries all gain from trade if they trade based on what we call comparative advantage, which just means that if we, as a country, we don't want to try to produce every good ourselves. We want to produce the goods that we're really efficient at producing, that we can produce very productively ourselves. And then we want to import the goods that we don't produce very productively ourselves. And then we're better off because we do that. You know, we can get more of every good by producing certain goods really efficiently and then trading for the other goods. And other countries can do the same thing, so that so trade based on comparative advantage can raise everybody's incomes. You know, that all countries gain, even if a country is really unproductive. You know, that they kind of, their workers are less productive on average on every good than other countries. Even those countries can gain from trade because there's certain goods that they'll be a little bit better at producing than other goods. So countries just focus on the goods where they're relatively efficient and then trade with each other, then they all gain. You know, that's convincing to economists, but to a lot of politicians, it's not, or either they don't understand it or they can't explain it very easily, so it doesn't make, you know, doesn't make for good politics. So yeah, so my view is very much more pro-trade than probably a lot of politicians. It's certainly more pro-trade than President Trump.
Are there any other questions? All right, thank you very much.